What's up, Kings fans? Welcome back to In the Pipeline, presented by SoCalGas. I am your host, Jack Jablonski, and to my left, as always, the Mayor, John Hoven. SoCalGas reminds you to call 811 2 days before you dig. So, John, we're back for part 2 of the forwards focus within the Kings prospect pool, and it couldn't be more timely as the NCAA conference tournaments are over and the big tournament is on the horizon. Now, the 3 guys that we're going to be covering today are all college players, and 2 Denver guys in James Reeder and Jared Wright, and then a third guy in Kenny Connors at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And we'll start with James Reeder because he's really turned some heads as a freshman at Denver University.
Yeah, look, DU's won a couple championships recently. They have a high-profile coach. So when you get a freshman coming in, you're thinking, okay, this player's probably not going to get a lot of playing time. College hockey tends to be more of a junior and senior type, situation at that level. This is a guy also that they weren't really sure when he was going to come into the NCAA. They watched his prior year in the USHL and were waiting to see how things really developed before he came in. He comes in, though, as a freshman, and he even spent time on the top line, Jack, which is unbelievable, earlier in the season. He's settled into more of the right wing role on the second line. He's getting good minutes. He has a high hockey IQ, and what I think differentiates that for him compared to a lot of other players is that high hockey IQ is at both ends of the rink. A lot of times that phrase is bounced around on the offensive side of the puck, but because of his size, he's a little bit on the smaller side. He's a little bit slender, still needs to bulk up. Maybe we can get into that, but because of that, he has to be a little bit more cerebral, a little bit more of a thinker when it comes to the defensive side of the play because he has a tendency maybe to get bounced around a little bit because he's not as physically developed as some of the larger players in the league.
You talk about high hockey IQ, and I think a stat for me that points out, and you mentioned that he's spent time on the top line. This is a very deep and top heavy, talented Denver team. So he's not getting, prime power play minutes and so on. He leads all forwards on Denver with a plus 17 plus minus as a freshman. I think that says a lot about his play. And then, we'll talk about his teammate in Jared Wright, who he has played on the same line with at times throughout the year. He defined him as one of the smartest players he's ever played against. This is a 19-year-old playing against 22, 23-year-olds. His ability to see the game and be an impact player on both levels or both ends of the ice says a lot about what he has been able to accomplish in his first year in college hockey.
Yeah, for sure. Look, if you're going to earn the trust of a coach as a first-year player coming in at any level, it could be in the NHL, it could be in the AHL, it could be in college. When you're a first-year player coming in on what we'll call a relatively stacked team, right? If you're a top 10 team in the country in college, you're a pretty good team. So if you're a freshman and you can come in and you can earn the confidence and the trust of the coaches, let alone your teammates, you're an intelligent player and you play both sides of the puck because, as you mentioned, he's not riding the coattails of other players, getting those cherry minutes. He's doing it the hard way and he's having a lot of success, or he's had a lot of success thus far. It's going to be interesting to see, what kind of an impact he can make in the tournament. This is probably a 3 to 4 year player as well. You're sort of playing the long game if you're the Kings with this player. You're waiting for him to, again, bulk up, add a little bit of size so that he can stand the rigors of professional hockey. Will he ultimately make it to the NHL? Look, you never want to put a ceiling on a player, but this is somebody who there's going to have to be some additions to his game, again, physically, in order to be able to withstand the challenges of the NHL. And that's where once he eventually makes it to the AHL, you'll really start to get a better feel for who this player is going to be. But to set the proper expectation, I think it's probably well down the road. You're looking at a player who could play 4 years of college hockey, and it's not a bad thing when you're playing in the system at Denver, again, one of the top teams in the country.
Yeah, for him being already a second-line guy, spending time both on the first and third line, wherever he is, as a freshman, I think it shows the ceiling that both David Carl, the head coach of Denver, has for him and the organization's trust within him. As you mentioned, a 3 to 4 year guy. Just to give some context, 7th round pick from the Kings this past year, but already surpassing those, estimations or prognostications. He's also 5'10", 170. So you mentioned bulking up, and for him, again, to have double-digit goals, double-digit assists in a season as a freshman without getting, a lot of special teams and opportunities in those areas, I think for him to be able to continue to add to his game. Like you said, in 3 to 4 years, you could see a guy who's putting up 50, 60 points within college hockey at a great program.
Yeah, again, I just think it's all about setting the right expectations, right? Mm-hmm. In our last program, looking at some other forwards, we, along with a lot of other people, whether it's scouts, fans, management, whatever, get excited talking about guys like Zemer and Greentree, guys that can play at the top end of the lineup, and guys that are really available or nearing their availability to turn pro a year or two after they get drafted. Sometimes when a guy is selected later, right, 6th, 7th round, you have to wonder, there's a reason why they were selected in those rounds. It's not that there's something wrong with them. It's just that there are attributes that need to be honed, need to be fine-tuned a little bit more in order for them to get to the next level. Size is something that comes into it, right? If he's 6'3", he's probably a 3rd-round draft pick instead of a 7th-round draft pick. That's just the way of the NHL, because that's just, when you're a scout and you're trying to predict where an 18-year-old kid is going to be in 3 to 5 years, it can be a real challenge, but size is one of those attributes that NHL teams look at, and really sports across the board, scouts look at.
You mentioned the size and where he is in the draft pit, or the draft, and how long it may take. I think a great comparison there to give you an example is, look at Andre Lee, right? He was a 6th round pick, I believe. 7th round pick, does 2 years or so in college hockey, comes out, makes his NHL debut. Like, this is a guy who is on an identical path, but maybe just another year or two longer in college hockey because of some of the things that he needs to add to his game.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, again, size is at the opposite end of the spectrum when you look at Andre Lee, who is 6'5" or 6'9", whatever he's up to these days. But the point is,
he just keeps growing.
He does. He just keeps growing, right? Every year at development camp, he seems to be a little bit taller than he was before. But yeah, it's a fair comparison from the standpoint of a later round pick has a couple of things to work on, and it doesn't mean that they won't eventually have the opportunity to play in the NHL. Matt Roy was a 7th round pick. He's in the NHL. So guys can ultimately make it to the NHL. They can make a lot of money playing in the NHL. It's just that their development path might be a little bit different or a little bit longer than somebody who's, perhaps a 1st round pick or even a 2nd round selection.
So we'll move to his teammate and sometimes line mate in Jared Wright, who is a very talented player, but a guy who I think is very underestimated when it comes to what he has in terms of NHL abilities.
Well, Jared Wright, I would describe and say he's a late bloomer. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of people might not have him on their radar. But this is a player who people should put on their radar. Him and Kenny Connors, who we'll talk about next, those are 2 players that I get really excited talking about. Because it's easy, in my opinion, to talk about guys like Greentree and Zemer that we did last week, because they can be human highlight reels at times. But you have somebody in Jared Wright who, he has the size, he's 6'3", he's such a powerful skater, he brings speed, so he has a lot of attributes that NHL teams are looking for. Again, he's probably not a top 6 player. I don't want to put a limit on him. You look at Laffy, right? He came in and 3rd-line player, but he's also spent time up top with Kopitar and Kempe. So you never want to put a ceiling on a player. You don't know where a player is ultimately going to end, but if he's probably in that middle 6 or bottom 6 player, sometimes they don't get the attention that those earlier picks do. But again, playing at Denver, national champion, and let's go one step further than Reeder. Wright was a player who David Carl, the coach, asked to come to Denver a year early. He was scheduled to go back to the USHL. He comes into Denver. This is a national championship level team who's asking a young player to come in. It really speaks to how talented he is and how much the coaches trusted in him really from day one. And now he's, finishing up his junior year and could potentially sign with the Kings here at the end of his season.
Wright is a guy that I get really excited about because he's the type of player that will go to a coach and say, what do you need from me? How do I make this team better? And he's not a first-line guy who's going to put up 50 points or score 25 goals. He's a guy who wants to shut down the other team. He's a guy that is focused and is literally, from Carl, the guy that it goes out and matches up against your team's best line. For me, I think in talking to him last week, there was a quote that he talked about that I think defines him perfectly. And he said, one of my greatest moments was being out there in the last 30 seconds of the national championship, shutting down BC, not scoring a goal. And he's the guy that just will do whatever you need, and he's got to be a coach's best friend.
I want to mention a couple of NHL players, not as comparables in their development path or the type of players that Wright might ultimately end up being, but really just more because it speaks to similar situations at this particular point, meaning they're in college and prior to becoming pro. And that would be Mikey Anderson and Laffey. You think about Mikey Anderson when he was in college, right? He was a middle round pick, so he wasn't getting a lot of that publicity that we've been mentioning of earlier picks. But he was that guy that the coaches trusted. They made him a captain. He made Team USA. And by the time he made it to the NHL, he had a swagger about him, right? He wasn't a typical prospect. And you see that with Laffey, the same thing. Laff's never even played a game in the American Hockey League. He jumped straight from Harvard into the NHL. Now, that's rare, and I don't think that that's going to be the path for Wright. But if it happened, it wouldn't surprise me. So there's another sort of person to add to this conversation would be Alec Martinez. He's a guy who didn't have that alpha the minute that he came out of college. Mikey Anderson was more of the alpha when he came out of college. So there are similarities, but Alec Martinez over the next 2 or 3 years after he left college and turned pro, he sort of morphed into that alpha. And so what I'm just referring to is there's a competitiveness about these type of players where they want to do anything. They'll handle the defensive side of it. They're very proud of shutting down the other team. They're well-rounded players. They're high hockey IQ type players. That's who Jared Wright is, and that's why I think you and I both get excited to talk about him.
Yeah, for me, I think in a solid comparison or explanation of the type of guy that he could become is you look at that Philippe Deneau, Warren Foegele, and Trevor Moore line. He's the type of guy that would fit that mold. Someone who can get in on the forecheck, create chaos, not only on the offensive end, trying to cause turnovers, but create chaos against the top line of all your division rivals with Edmonton, and he's that matchup line guy.
Well, he's also an elite skater too.
Exactly.
So when you have that power in your base and you're an elite skater, then the coach is going to trust you to go out there and handle those other matchups.
Yeah, no question. He's one of the fastest guys that the Kings have within their prospect pool, and he's someone that takes pride in playing that type of game. So he's one that loves to do the dirty work. He doesn't care about getting his nose dirty. That's his game. And if he's doing that, then he's extremely effective. And he's been doing that all year. And frankly, since he's been a Denver Pioneer. So we'll move to our third and final prospect in Kenny Connors. He's at UMass-Amherst in an extremely tough conference in Hockey East.
It's like Murderer's Row over there with BC, BU, it just
Maine. It's just one after another, like 5 of the top 10 teams. UMass being one of those teams that's right in contention for cup contention in terms of a championship. Now, he's a big, physical, fast guy who I think Kings fans will be definitely happy to see if they get their eyes on him.
We keep saying these are players that we like to talk about. I have all the time in the world for Kenny Connors and have really talked him up quite a bit over the last couple of years. I think the biggest difference between Connors and Wright, just as a comparable, is that, there are more noticeable attributes with Jared Wright, in part because he's 6'3" and he's so fast. Kenny Connors is a little bit more unassuming, but the label on him is gamer. This kid is a gamer. He's involved in the action constantly. He's very unassuming. He's sneaky with his offense. You even go back to Team USA when he was at the World Juniors. He wasn't leading the tournament in scoring, but he scored one of the biggest goals of that tournament when the team went on, to win. So he's one of those players that when you dig a little bit deeper and you go beyond the numbers, because here's a guy who, he doesn't always score, and then all of a sudden he'll rattle off 8 games in a row where he'll score a goal too. So you can't just look at goals. You can't just look at the points with a player like this. He's going to be an impact player at the NHL level in a bottom 6 role, most likely. Again, you don't want to put a ceiling on guys. But both Wright and Connors coming in, these guys are locks to make the NHL.
You talked about Team USA and how all of a sudden he kind of snuck up on you, had a big goal in one of the games. He's the type of guy that in that tournament, I think he started on the 4th line. By the end of the tournament, was playing 2nd, 3rd line minutes because of the impact that he has. Very unassuming, like you said. You talked about the comparison in terms of the sexiness with some of the speed and the height of Jared Wright, and then you look at Connors, who's a different type of player, but has the same type of impact. And for me, they're both of the type of players that will say, "Coach, what do you need from me? What can I do?" And the coach for both of those two will say 2 different things for him. 2 different roles. But for Connors, he's the guy that in a different way is a nasty guy, a guy who's happy to be in front of the net, muck things up. And for him, he's unfortunately dealing with an injury that he sustained in the conference tournament. Still going to be able to play through it, but it is hampering him a little bit. But it kind of talks to you about the grittiness that this guy has to be dealing with a pretty significant injury.
Yeah, no, you're right. Gritty is a good way to put it, because he's that guy who's going to go to the dirty areas. He's the guy who brings that grit, that nastiness. And I would agree with you when you say, that there are similarities to Wright and that both are going to want to do whatever it takes to win. A coach is going to say, you do this and you do that.
Yeah.
So that the way they get deployed is going to be a little bit different. And both are important and can be effective in terms of helping a team win. Connors, to me, is one of those players you have to have on your team if you plan on winning. And that's what makes it so important for Kenny Connors to eventually turn pro, continue his development path, and then ultimately make the LA Kings.
I love the way you put that. He's a guy that you want to have on your team if you win. To me, he's what playoff success is about. I compare him a little bit to like a Matthew Tkachuk, a guy who all of a sudden he's going to be down below the goal line. He's going to be someone that teams hate playing against. He describes himself as someone who wants to use his size and his body. He's a thick guy. He's around 200 pounds, 6'1", and it's just hard to go through him. He talks about how he likes being a power forward and wants to be physical and fast and in your face.
Well, if you come watch some of the development games when he's come to Los Angeles, he is that player, right? He's a little stocky, and he's not afraid to use his size. And that, again, I think that's going to give him an advantage once he ultimately does turn pro and he's at the American League level. He's not going to be as intimidated as some of these guys who come in, and there's nothing wrong with that, coming in a little undersized, needing to work on their development. Not that Connors can't continue to train and do those sorts of things, but he's going to come in with a little bit of a leg up compared to some other guys, and that ultimately helps players. And we've seen that in the past. Again, I keep coming back to guys like Mikey Anderson, guys like Laff, guys that are a little bit more physically developed and understand what it means to use their size. It gives them just a little bit of extra space out there.
Yeah, no question. For me, the last thing I have on Connors is he's the type of guy that James Reeder is kind of on that path for. A guy that needed to add some size, needed to round out his game in year 2, year 3. Connors is a junior. You look back to Reeder, who's a freshman, different types of players, but that's the mold in terms of, okay, you get to college and you need a few things to work on. Here's 2-3 years playing really good minutes. Then all of a sudden, now you can look at signing a contract after your junior or senior year in college.
Yeah, we'll have to see if he can develop that nastiness. It's something that we haven't necessarily seen out of Reeder, and it's hard to teach as well. That high-level compete is hard to teach. That it's just players sort of either have it or they don't. Occasionally, guys do develop that throughout their course, so we'll have to see if that ends up happening with Reeder. But I think Kenny Connors is going to be a fan favorite at any level that he plays. When he gets to the American League, when he gets to the NHL, I think fans are really going to gravitate towards Kenny Connors. He's the kind of guy who puts his work boots on, grabs his lunch pail, and gets to getting.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And that's going to wrap it up for In the Pipeline, presented by SoCalGas. We'll see you next time.
In the Pipeline is presented by SoCalGas. SoCalGas reminds us to call 811 2 days before digging.